One of the things that I stressed when we were talking about the book of Mark just a couple of weeks ago is that Mark really deals with authority, showing the tremendous authority that Jesus had. He showed that Jesus had authority over nature. He also shows that Jesus has authority over disease, that Jesus has authority over various things that would come up in reference to forgiving people of their sins. Jesus was a tremendous compassionate person. The word compassion flows all the way through his life. No matter what he does, no matter where he goes, it always seems to have the idea of that it's enclosed in compassion for people. Jesus had a tremendous love for people. Well, I want you to notice here that we're dealing with Mark chapter 4. If you want to turn your Bible to about verse 35, we're going to go through chapter 5 and say some things about what was happening at that time. Again, we're going to discover that the main theme here is authority. And naturally, this would appeal to the Romans, to whom we believe that Mark was writing this particular book. So what we have here is, first of all, we have a tremendous storm that comes up. And it says in verse 35, "On the same day when evening was come, he said to them, 'Let us cross over to the other side.'" Now he's talking about the Sea of Galilee. This was also called the Sea of Tiberias. That was a sort of you might say a proper name that was given to it. But it was a sea that, even though it was small, yet the fact remained that it could be very treacherous at times. And so we're not at all surprised that what we find here is that Jesus and his disciples are caught in a storm. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of being in a boat and, being caught in a storm. But I remember when I was about 16 years of age, I went up into the northeast coast of Scotland. I went up there to see the man who had led me to Christ, Brother Samuel Hunter. But also I went up there because the brethren said that they would have me preach when I came up that way. And so I was excited about that. While I was there was a man in the church called Touchstrachan. And there were so many family names, like there were so many Strachans that they would give each other nicknames. And this particular man was called Touch, and he was a seaman and had been a fisherman for many, many years. His son Alec owned a commercial fishing vessel, and so Touchstrachan said, "Alec, why don't you take Nat out for a 2-day catch?" And so we went out. We were somewhere between Norway and Scotland when a storm broke up. Well, I'll tell you, the force winds, the lowered clouds, the chappy seas, the darkness, except for the ship's lighting, hung on us like a dark blanket. And I tried to climb the stairs from down where we were sleeping. There were actually, at this particular boat, berth 9, and to try and find my way upstairs, I was just thrown from one side of the rail to the other. In fact, it took every bit of strength I had to be able to fight against the motion of the ship. One of the things that disturbed me, the reason I was trying to get out of the berthing area was that I discovered that I was sleeping underwater. I could hear the sea hitting the side of this boat in the storm. And when I saw the crew in the wheelhouse at the top of the stairwell, well, they were standing there praying, and that got my attention very quickly. That picture has never left me, and I remember the discussion at that time was, should we cut the nets? And what they would do is in the middle of a storm, they would, if the nets were out, which were about the size of a regular football field, and cost several, actually cost a couple of $100,000 at the time. They would cut it, and then they would determine the velocity of the wind, and they would the motion of the boat, and the coxswain would come up with figures and determine that if we cut it here, that we could intercept the net further on down the sea. And so that's what they were talking about. And in our lesson today, we will see that there are storms of various kinds. And Jesus was demonstrated his authority over winds and waves and demons and disease. And by the time we get to John the 11th chapter, we find there the raising of Lazarus from the dead. But in the very next chapter, we have Jairus' daughter, and she's just a 12-year-old girl, and she had died, and Jesus showed his authority over death. And so Mark said his gospel was good news. And so let's see what the good news is for us today as we study together. Notice, if you would, that there are storms listed by Mark. Jesus calms the storm in chapter 4, beginning in verse 35 through verse 41. And Jesus and his disciples would have been crossing from the west to the east side of the lake. Because if you notice in chapter 5 and 1, it says, "And then they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gadarenes." And this was on the opposite side of the sea. And there were fewer people that lived in that particular area of the country. And evidently Jesus wanted to get away from the multitudes that had given him no rest all of that day. If you'll notice chapter 3, I was very interested noting as I was reading over my lesson that in verse 7 it says, "But Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea, and a great multitude from Galilee followed him, and from Judea." And then you look at the same chapter in verse 20. "Then the multitude came together again, so that they could not so much as eat bread." And so these were people that were crowded around them. They wanted to hear the gospel. They wanted to see this one who had done so many wonderful miracles, and who spoke as having authority and not as the scribes. And Mark normally didn't give precise time designations, but here he does. But he deals with morning, and he deals with evening. And no doubt that's those who are reading this can form a picture in their mind of what is going on. And probably he did so here, saying it was evening, to impress the reader with Jesus' extreme busyness, that he worked from early morning until sometimes late at night, and now he is forced to withdraw temporarily for a while. So in verse 37 and 38 of chapter 4, I want you to notice with me, it says, "And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that it was already filling." Now, the boat I was on was a much larger boat. It berthed 9 people. It was a commercial fishing vessel. And that's about all I can tell you about it. But I do know that this boat that Jesus was on was more than just a very small craft. It had sails and what have you for his disciples to have been with him. It had been cone-shaped, the area where he was, and all the way around the Lake of Galilee. It had cone-shaped crevices that ran from the land down to the sea. And Jesus was probably sleeping on a seat in the stern, on a pillow, Mark tells us. And this actually, this perhaps cushioned it for him. He must have been affected by physical exhaustion. And this is another indication of his full humanity, because Mark tells us that he was asleep. Well, this is the only place where Matthew, Mark, and Luke recorded Jesus sleeping, though he slept at other times, of course. But Mark alone recorded the disciples' rebuke. So if you'll notice in verse 38, it says, "But he was in the stern, asleep on a pillow. And they awoke him, and they said to him," pardon me, said, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" As far as they were concerned, they were perishing. They didn't see any way out of this storm. This storm was bigger than any abilities that they had for survival. And so this is a sort of a little rebuke in a way. Don't you care about us? Look what's happening. And so Mark alone recorded the disciples' rebuke. But it was inappropriate because of who Jesus was. Can you imagine saying this to the Son of God? You see, by now, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, because later on we're going to find that Jesus was mystified by his disciples, that they had not really caught on to many of the spiritual implications of being with him and the miracles that he performed. The implication is that there is nothing that could get in his way, but that he could handle it. And so note the contrast between the disciples' anxiety and Jesus' lack of concern. Do you not recognize this cry of distrust? Because basically, that's what it was. And I really get the feeling from reading this section that Jesus thought on the part of the disciples there should have been less and less mistrust, and there should have been more and more faith. And so it was a cry of distrust, but one often matched by believers today in difficult circumstances when they feel that the Lord has forsaken him. We're really basically in the same boat. We're really not any different from the disciples. Think back to times when occasions have come up before you in the form of a storm in your life, and you were sort of wondering, nervous, what shall I do? Where shall I go? What should I what exercise should I do here to survive? Where was the Lord when the Son of Man, where was God when the Son of Man died? One lady came up and asked that to an old preacher friend that I knew, Brother C.R. Nickel, and she said to him, "Brother Nickel, where was God the day that my son died?" In other words, you can see a little bit of distrust there on her part. But you know, Brother Nickel gave her a very wise answer. He said, "Dear sister, I imagine he was the same place he was the day his own son died." Because a lot of times, you see, we want to separate God from storms. But he knows storms very, very well. And he knows how to work in the midst of storms. And so he does here. Why is this happening to me? The disciples should not have been fearful. They had already been warned about this. We're going to the other side. Well, first, Jesus had told them that they were going to the other side. We see that in verse 35. And then second, he was with them, and they would not die, because he would not die before his time. And he often spoke this way to his disciples, particularly in the book of John. And then thirdly, Jesus was sleeping peacefully and was not afraid of the storm. So his whole demeanor should have sent them the message, in view of all the supernatural things he had done, that everything's all right, fellas. Just settle down. I'm with you. Everything is all right. And then in the fourth place, he had demonstrated compassion for them and the multitudes many times. Here was the most compassionate individual on the face of God's green earth, sitting right there in the boat with them. Now, if you'll notice in verse 38, I believe it is, but he was in the stern asleep on a pillow, and they awoke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? That word is very important. They saw themselves as perishing. They had already made their mind up on the outcome. And so if you'll notice in verse 35, what time of day was it? On the same day when evening had come. That's the thing about it. Darkness has a way of adding to the fright of this particular experience, because all you can see is a few feet off to the side of the boat. You can see the waves as the wind lashes them like a whip, and it just makes you more afraid. What kind of storm was it? Well, verse 37, it says it was a great windstorm that arose, and the waves beat up into the boat so that it was already filling. So the water would lash against the side of the boat and spill over. My own father was an officer in the Royal Navy. He was on a ship called Her Majesty's ship Hotspur in the English Channel during the Second World War. One of his fellow seamen had become sick and vomited, and my dad was trying to wash that away so that someone would not slide down in it and go over the rail. Well, they were in the midst of a gale at the time. That was a very strenuous storm and powerful winds, and all of a sudden he described it as like a giant arm came over the rail in the form of water, picked him up, and the next thing he knew, he was in the English Channel. And he was in there for about 20 minutes. And they were able to save him because he had held on to a white enamel basin. And the lights that are scanning the waters looking for him picked up on this. And that's what saved his life. But he would often tell me, he lost his watch. When they got him out, he had lost his wedding ring. When he got him out of the water, he had lost his sea boots, his jersey. He said for the most part it had disrobed him. The sea had disrobed him. He said this was a very, very scary experience that he said he would never forget. And then notice, if you would, beginning in verse 39, the solution. So in 39, it says, Then he arose and rebuked the wind, and he said to the sea. So notice, he rebukes the wind, the force, the gale force that was being brought against the water. Then he turns and speaks to the water. And he said to the water, or he said to the sea, Peace, be still. Just like here's a crying child, and he says, Shh, shh, hush, be still, be quiet. He speaks to the sea like it was a person. And he tells the sea to be quiet. And what does it do? It comes quiet. It does exactly what he asks it to do. This recalls the power of God over the chaos of creation. Both episodes are affected solely by this word. In Mark's story, the sea is a place of chaos and destruction, as well as of instruction and fellowship. I'll guarantee you, after the disciples had this experience, you could not convince them that he did not have power over some of the strongest elements that a human can experience in life. So Jesus expressed disappointment that the disciples had not demonstrated more of a mature faith in this matter. If you'll notice in chapter 7 of Mark, and I've got a load of scriptures on this, but in Mark chapter 7, I want you to read with me, see what scripture I'm going to use the first one here, Mark 7 and verse 18. And here it says, he said unto them, are you thus without understanding also? He says, do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from the outside cannot defile him? Now later on we're going to get into clean and unclean, and that's the context of that. But notice that there are times when he upbraids them, like in chapter 8, 17 and 18, verse 21, 32 through 33, chapter 9, verse 19. We could go on, where he expected his disciples to be further along in their faith. Let me ask you a question. If Christ were here today, where do you think he would expect you to be in your faith? Where do you think he would expect me to be in my faith? Is my faith in neutral? There's no such thing. Your faith is either going forward or your faith is going backwards. But it is never neutral. And so he constantly. And yet here we're told that that they were timid. He calls them timid, is the word. It means fearful. And so notice in the 40th verse, but he said to them, why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith? He connected their fearfulness with a lack of faith. And so they did not yet realize, I think, that Jesus, they didn't realize fully, I'll put it that way, that Jesus was indeed the Son of God, the one who can control nature. And I've got a lot of scriptures on that, but we can't take time to look them up. So Jesus anticipates understanding on the part of the disciples. And it seems that they reflected a lack of understanding, a lack of faith. So the upshot is that conflict erupts between Jesus and the disciples. And now nowhere is there more apparent than in a series of 3 boat scenes and 2 feeding miracles, with the miracles interspersed among the boat scenes. It seems that amid those experiences they had with his miracles, that there was this struggle of getting a hand on firmly, thou art the Son of God. They had not arrived at that as yet. So in verse 41, they feared exceedingly and said one to another. Now, here they are in private conversation. He's still sitting there on that pillow at the other end of the boat at the stern. It says, who can Who can this be? See, there's still one in a quandary as to his full identity. Now, who can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him? Let me ask you, how far would you walk to meet a man who had this sort of power? That's why the multitudes were following him everywhere he went. So, notice, if you would, we'll go on down here, skip a few thoughts here, but notice that this story should encourage all of Jesus' disciples with the knowledge that he can control the natural circumstances of life. He can control anything that comes up. I really think that we as Christians, I have this thought every now and again, that we as Christians don't ask from him or fully expect from him what he is capable of doing in our lives. We just don't. And yet he stands ready. Perhaps he's sitting on a pillow. He's looking in our direction. And he's saying, when will their faith ever grow to what they can expect from me? And so this includes life storms and keeping us safe. A comforting revelation to Mark's original readers in their precautions. Early Christian art, we're told by archaeologists, depicts the church as a boat, and it's driven upon a perilous sea, and with Jesus in the midst, and he is calming not only the storm, but their souls. He's calming them as people, and he's saying, you have nothing to fear. This was a fundamental assumption that he is the God-man. God, but still man. Knows, understands everything that life can throw at us. God has not has not promised favorable seas to all those that join his navy. And for every pain that rends the heart, the man of sorrows had a part. Paul says that he was tempted, tried in all ways like we are, and yet without sin. Now this takes us then, if you'll notice, into chapter 5. And I want you to notice with me, beginning in verse 1. It says, then they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gadarenes. And it says in verse 2, and when he had come out of the boat, immediately, Mark tells us, there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. I'll tell you, I have seen various pieces of art that have tried to depict what this man looked like. I'll guarantee you, as I sit here today, and as we're talking together, none of the art ever came close to what this man actually looked like. The turmoil that must have been in this man's life. The fact that he was overcome by an evil spirit. Then notice the place where he lived. He lived in a graveyard. We don't hear them called that today, do we? Called the Woodlawn Cemetery. It makes you feel like you want to buy a tent at Sears and go down there and camp out. It looks so pretty. There was a time when cemeteries were called graveyards, not woodlawn cemeteries, but graveyards. And when you thought of a graveyard, you thought of a very unpleasant place with tombstones that were weathered, were There was nothing really beautiful about it at all. And so you thought of death naturally. And so if you'll notice, it says, who had his dwelling among the tombs. That's where he lived. And no one could bind him, not even with chains. He had super strength, and yet they tried to capture him with ropes and strings. The scripture says, with ropes and with chains, and no matter what they did, this man could not be captivated. In verse 4, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been pulled apart by him. Houdini was not a match for this man. It says, and the shackles broken in pieces, neither could anyone tame him. Now this means getting past the ropes, getting past the shackles, getting past the chains, and coming to the man himself. The man couldn't even be affected. He couldn't even be tamed or chained. And all that is controlled. And verse 5, and always, night and day, he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying out and cutting himself with stones. Can you imagine this? Where he would take sharp pieces of stone, and he was uncontrollably cutting himself. Blood marks all over him, swelling, all sorts of indications that this man, emotionally and physically, inside and outside, was totally not in control. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and worshiped him. Now, what I want for us to see here, if I can, for just a moment, some thoughts on this, that the tombs were sort of outside the city, like some of our tombs and cemeteries are today. And perhaps the devil drove him to the tombs to make the people fancy that the souls of the dead were turned into demons. I don't know. But we do not associate life or pleasantries with tombstones and the cemetery. And the touch of a grave to the Jew was polluting. Numbers 19 and 16 teaches us that. And the unclean spirit drives people into that company that is defiling, and so keeps holding on, having possession of him. Christ was rescuing souls out of Satan's power, saves the living from among the dead, and he's still doing it today. So he was a very strong and ungovernable man. And not only cords would not hold him, but chains and fetters and iron could not control him. We see that in verse 3 and 4. And some notoriously willful sinners are like this madman, as we said a moment ago. There are people who may not be bound in chains, but they're bound inasmuch as Satan has convinced them of a particular lifestyle, of a certain value system, and they've bought into it, and as a result their life is captivated by Satan. And that's why I said that Jesus is still freeing men today from Satan through the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. So the commands and curses of the law are as chains and fetters, and to restrain sinners from their wicked courses. But they break those bands in sunder, and it is evidence of the power that the devil has of them. And so he was a terror and a torment to himself and to all that were about him. Look at verse 5. He always, night and day, he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying out and cutting himself with stones. Can you imagine seeing such a scene out in a graveyard? It would just, it would give me, the only way I know to put it is it'd give me the heebie-jeebies. I'd find myself trying to get out of there, just seeing this man. And so this wretched creature was night and day in the mountains and in the tombs, crying and cutting himself, and either bemoaning his own deplorable case or in a rage and indignation against heaven because of his condition, perhaps blaming heaven for what he was going through. And so the voice of God is, do yourself no harm. The voice of Satan is, do yourself all the harm that you can. Let me tell you something, friend. Satan has made a lot of attractive deals to all of us, but he's never been known to keep a one of them. He's only interested in one thing. He may butter you up. He may have all sorts of lovely things to say about you, but he's got one main motive behind it. He wants to captivate your life. He wants to bind you in fetters. He wants you to destroy yourself. Ultimately, he wants to send all of us to hell. But look at verse 6. When he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and worshipped him. When he saw Jesus from afar off, it's made me wonder, what made him run to Jesus? Was it the fact that that's what he usually did when he saw another human being? And then he would do what he could to fill their lives full of fright, as was his occasion to do. Well, coming ashore, he saw Jesus come ashore. He ran and he worshipped him. He usually ran upon others with rage. But I want you to notice the word worship here. He ran upon Jesus with reverence. Wow. That must have been a beautiful scene. To see this man who his whole demeanor, his whole life is summed up in the word rage. And yet what does he do? He comes to Jesus and approaches Jesus. And he engages Jesus in worship. That change that was in that man, from rage to reason, that was done by the heart of Christ, which could not be done with chains and fetters. His fury was all of a sudden, it was restricted. That's what Jesus can do for a person. I have a lot of old books in my library. There's one that has an account in it. These are supposed to be like newspaper accounts that actually happened in community life. Back in the latter part of the 1800s, there was a lady called Lady Anne Artwell. And she was riding in her coach one Sunday afternoon, and she saw a large crowd. And then she realized there's only one person speaking. Then she realized it's a preacher. And so he was standing on a piece of vacant ground, and he was preaching. And she said to her horseman, "Pull my carriage up alongside here. I want to listen." And so he did. Well, the preacher recognized Lady Anne Artwell's carriage. He recognized who was in that carriage. And so in his sermon he said, there is an auction going on today. The auction is for the soul of Lady Anne Artwick. It's the devil who's conducting the auction. And he's asking the question, folks, what will you give me for the soul of Lady Anne Artwick? Will you give me diamonds? Will you give me status? Will you give me position? Will you give me power? Will you give me acclaim? What will you give me for the soul of Lady Anne Artwick? And this account says that rather slowly, the brass knob on the handle on the carriage door opened, and the carriage door came open, and out stepped Lady Anne Artwick. And here she is dressed in her Victorian dress. And she fell to her knees, clasped her hands up under her chin, and in the direction of the crowd, she said, "Give me Jesus." Oh, I tell you, Jesus is the only one who can satisfy what's going on in your soul, what's going on in my soul. And let me tell you, the waves are not big enough to deal with the power that he has over us and over what bothers us. It says that he ran and he worshiped him. And so even the devil in this poor creature, which could not be done, was forced to tremble before Christ and bow to him. Or rather, the power of Satan is in and over him being, for this instant, is suspended. Jesus has control over this man's life. So in verse 8, it says, "For he said to him, 'Come out of the man, unclean spirit.'" But I want to read to you verse 7. It says, "And he cried out with a loud voice and said, 'What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of Most High God? I implore you by God that you do not torment me.'" It's like the evil spirit speaking. Like the evil spirit sees him as the most dreaded opposition that he could ever come up against. And it was Jesus. He says, "For he said to him, 'Come out of the man, unclean spirit.'" Just like he spoke to the sea. He spoke to the spirit world. He said to this unclean spirit, "Come out of the man." Then he asked him, "What is your name?" And he answered, saying, "My name is Legion, for we are many." So also he begged him earnestly that he would not send them off out of the country. Now a large herd of swine was feeding there near the mountains. And so all the demons begged him, saying, "Send us to the swine, that we may enter them." And at once Jesus gave them permission. Then the unclean spirits went out and entered the swine. There were about 2,000. The herd ran violently down the steep place into the sea and drowned in the sea. So those who fed the swine fled and told it in the city and the country, and they went out to see what it was that happened. People started streaming out there. And so Jesus showed his tremendous power. He says, "Come out of the man." And people started streaming out there. And I want you to notice the fright which the devil had of Christ. Just a few words on that. The man ran. and worshiped Christ. But it was the devil in the man that cried with a loud voice, making use of the poor man's tongue, "What have I to do with you?" Verse 7. He calls God the Most High God above all other gods. By the name Elion, the Most High, God was known among the Phoenicians and the other nations that bordered about Israel. And by that name, the devil calls him. So he admits Jesus to be the Son of God. You would expect him to say the opposite. This is not a cordial meeting that we have here going on. The most fair-spoken hypocrite cannot say better than to call Jesus the Son of God. And yet, that the devil did. He disowns any design against Christ. What have I to do with thee? I have no need of thee. I pretend to none. I desire to have nothing to do with thee. I cannot stand before thee. I would certainly fall. Wow. What a picture he has. And it's not the picture of victory with the Son of God. It's a picture of defeat. And so he disapproves of his rage. I adjure you, that is, I earnestly beseech you, by all that is sacred, I beg of thee, for God's sake, by whose permission I have gotten possession of this man, that though you drive me out hence, that you torment me not, that thou not restrain me from doing mystery elsewhere. Though I know I am sentenced, yet let me not be sent to the chains of darkness, or hindered from going to and fro to devour. So, what are some thoughts from this? If Jesus is on your side, let me tell you, friend, you're not coming in second. You're coming in first. You're going to be the winner. Anytime we do or make a choice for what Christ has said for us to do and reject the words of Satan, we are always coming out winners. Storms cost a lot. We need to be sure that we learn from them. It's sad to see what some people go through today, and yet they never seem to learn. They never really get the point. Something like the disciples, a little bit of the disciples here. In your life you may think it is night, but Jesus works in the night just as well as in the day. When the storms of life become too much, then this writer, Mark, reminds us of the good news about Jesus Christ, that he indeed is the Son of God. And there is no calmness that needs to be brought about in your life, but he's willing to do it, and he can do it, and he will do it. Thank you for listening.